The crowd was stunned, their eyes locked on the manager, who was now visibly shaken. The air in the room was thick with tension, and all you could hear was the faint buzz of someone's phone recording the moment. No one moved, no one dared to speak. It was a scene that no one could have anticipated, but one that no one would ever forget. But how did it come to this? Let's rewind. It all began on a bright, ordinary afternoon. The kind of day where the sun filters through clean glass windows and casts warm, inviting rays on polished floors. The establishment, an upscale store known for its impeccable service, was alive with the quiet hum of activity. Shoppers meandered through neatly arranged aisles, their arms brushing against racks of high-end clothing. Others sat in a cozy lounge area, sipping coffee from artisan mugs while flipping through the latest fashion catalogs. The ambience was pristine, professional, almost too perfect, as if no disturbance could ever break its rhythm. But of course, appearances can be deceiving. Amid the soft murmur of conversation and the occasional beep of a cashier's scanner, a new presence walked through the door. Enter our protagonist, a poised, confident black customer with an easy grace about them. They weren't here to cause a scene or draw attention. No, they had come for something simple, a shopping trip, maybe a treat for themselves after a long week. Little did they know, this ordinary errand would soon spiral into something extraordinary. Let's get to know them a little more. They're someone you'd admire instantly if you met them. Hardworking and focused, they've spent years building a life they're proud of. A single parent, perhaps, raising a bright and curious child while juggling the demands of a career. Or maybe they're an entrepreneur, the kind of person who wakes up before dawn, not because they have to, but because they're chasing dreams that can't wait. Either way, they carry themselves with dignity, a quiet strength that commands respect without asking for it. As they entered, the soft jingle of the doorbell caught a few glances, but nothing unusual. They moved with purpose, taking in the sleek displays and the warm glow of the recessed lighting. Everything about them said they belonged here, just like anyone else. And yet, as we'll see, some people still couldn't see past the surface. But in this moment, nothing seemed out of place. The protagonist smiled politely at the first employee they saw, nodded in thanks when a fellow customer stepped aside to let them pass. The world, at least for now, seemed to be running as it should. It was the kind of scene that makes you wonder how things could ever go wrong. And yet, this very space, this seemingly perfect haven of commerce and civility, was about to reveal cracks in its polished exterior. Cracks that would soon expose something darker. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the story that would leave a crowd stunned, a manager shaken, and countless lives changed forever was just beginning. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about ordinary moments and the extraordinary ways they can unfold. As the protagonist navigated through the store, there was a sense of ease about them. They were used to spaces like these bright, upscale environments where customer service was supposedly king. They moved with quiet confidence, taking their time to explore the neatly curated displays. But soon, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing most people might overlook, but to the protagonist, it was a familiar pattern, a pattern they'd encountered far too often. It began with the first employee they approached. The protagonist had noticed a pair of shoes on display, tucked neatly behind a glass case. They walked over to the nearest associate, a young man with a name tag that read Evan. Evan was standing at the counter, chatting with another employee, both of them laughing softly about something. The protagonist waited patiently, a polite smile on their face, but Evan didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he kept talking, his gaze sliding over them as if they weren't even there. When the protagonist finally spoke, clearing their throat to gently ask for assistance, Evan's response was curt, almost dismissive. "Someone else will help you in a moment," he said without looking up. Then, as if to punctuate his indifference, he turned away entirely, resuming his conversation as though nothing had happened. Now, the protagonist wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. They'd been taught to pick their battles, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Evan was just having a bad day. Maybe he didn't mean to come across as rude. But as they turned to look around the store, a different picture began to emerge. Just a few feet away, another customer, this one white, dressed in casual clothes, approached a different employee with a question. The response couldn't have been more different. The associate greeted the customer with a warm smile, bending over backward to assist them. They laughed, chatted, even offered suggestions for additional purchases. The protagonist watched this interaction unfold, the contrast stark and undeniable. Still, they chose to let it go. After all, they weren't here to make a scene. They moved further into the store, Spotting another item that caught their interest, a sleek jacket displayed on a mannequin. Once again, they approached an employee, this time a middle-aged woman with an air of authority. Her name tag read Linda. The protagonist smiled, pointing to the jacket. "Excuse me, could you help me with this item?" they asked politely. Linda glanced at them briefly, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Let me check," she said, and walked off without another word. The protagonist waited, glancing at their watch as the minutes ticked by. 5 minutes turned into 10, and still, Linda didn't return. Meanwhile, the protagonist noticed her assisting another customer in the corner of the store. She hadn't forgotten. She'd chosen not to come back. By now, the pattern was clear. The smiles that came so easily for others were withheld from the protagonist. The attentiveness shown to other customers seemed to evaporate when it came to them. It wasn't overt, not yet, but it was there, a quiet exclusion, a subtle but persistent reminder that they weren't being treated the same. And as much as the protagonist tried to brush it off, they couldn't ignore the growing knot in their stomach. Then, it happened. The moment that changed everything. The protagonist, still waiting by the jacket display, noticed someone approaching from across the store. It was the manager. Tall and sharply dressed, they carried themselves with the kind of authority that turned heads. At first glance, they seemed professional, even approachable, with a polished smile that suggested they were here to help. But the protagonist would soon discover that appearances could be deceiving. "Good afternoon," the manager said, their tone light but clipped. "Is there something I can assist you with?" The protagonist nodded, relieved to finally have someone's attention. They explained how they'd been waiting for assistance with the jacket and pointed out the employee who had left them hanging. The manager listened, nodding in all the right places. But something about their expression didn't sit right. It was a little too tight. Their smile a little too forced. "I see," the manager said, their voice taking on a patronizing edge. "Well, we're very busy today. Perhaps you could be a little more patient next time." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The protagonist blinked, caught off guard by the shift in tone. They hadn't been rude or demanding, they'd simply asked for help. And yet, the manager's words carried an undercurrent of blame, as if the protagonist were somehow at fault for the poor service they'd received. "I understand you're busy," the protagonist said calmly, keeping their voice steady despite the sting of the manager's words. "But I've been waiting for quite a while, and I've noticed that other customers are being helped much faster." It was a reasonable statement, delivered without anger or accusation, but the manager's expression darkened. They straightened, their body language shifting from polite to defensive. "I'm sorry you feel that way," they said, their tone cold now, "but we treat all our customers equally." The protagonist knew better than to argue. They'd heard this line before, the go-to defense for behavior that couldn't be justified. But they also knew they couldn't let it slide. They stood their ground, meeting the manager's gaze with quiet determination. "I don't believe that's true," they said evenly. "And I think the way I've been treated today reflects that." The tension in the room was palpable now. Nearby customers had started to notice the exchange, their eyes flicking between the protagonist and the manager. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort. A few even looked away, pretending not to see. But the protagonist didn't flinch. They held their ground, refusing to be intimidated. And as the manager's composure began to crack, it became clear that this encounter was far from over. The tension had settled over the store like a storm cloud, and for a moment, it seemed like the conversation might end there, tense but manageable. But the manager wasn't finished. Their forced smile faded entirely, replaced by a harder, more confrontational expression. And then, with a sharp inhale and a glance around the room, they crossed a line the protagonist knew all too well. "Excuse me," the manager said, their tone icy now, "but we've been having issues with shoplifting lately, and I need to ensure that everything is in order." The accusation hit like a slap. It wasn't outright, not yet, but the implication was crystal clear. The protagonist's heart sank, though their face remained calm. They could feel the weight of the manager's words pressing down on them, heavy with unspoken prejudice. The words weren't just an insult, they were an accusation wrapped in professional politeness, designed to demean without being explicit. A tactic the protagonist had encountered more times than they cared to count. "Shoplifting?" The protagonist repeated, their voice even, though their pulse quickened. "I'm sorry you're accusing me of something." They stood tall, refusing to let the humiliation show, even as they felt the eyes of other customers on them. Across the room, a few people exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked down at their phones, pretending not to hear. The manager tilted their head, arms crossed, their posture stiff with self-righteousness. I'm not accusing anyone, they said in a tone that was anything but neutral. But we've had to keep a closer eye on things lately. Company policy. They punctuated the statement with a pointed glance at the protagonist's bag, which hung casually over their shoulder, as though it were evidence of something sinister. The protagonist resisted the urge to let their anger flare. Instead, they calmly opened their bag, revealing nothing but a wallet, phone, and a few personal items. "Feel free to take a look," they said firmly. "There's nothing in here but what I walked in with." They turned slightly, giving the manager a clear view. Their composure was unshaken, their voice measured, but inside they felt the familiar sting of being singled out without cause. The manager hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the protagonist's openness. But instead of backing down, they doubled down. Their voice grew sharper, their body language more aggressive. "It's not just about the bag," they said, their gaze narrowing. "We've received complaints about disruptive behavior. If you can't follow our policies, I'll have to ask you to leave." Disruptive behavior. The words hung in the air, absurd and baseless. The protagonists couldn't believe what they were hearing. They hadn't raised their voice, hadn't even shown a hint of disrespect. And yet, here they were accused of being a problem simply for existing in this space. "What exactly have I done that's disruptive?" the protagonist asked, their tone still calm but tinged with steel now. They refused to let the manager's accusations rattle them, though the weight of the moment pressed hard against their chest. "I've asked for assistance. I've waited patiently. If that's disruptive, then I'd like to understand what you mean." The manager's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. Their authority was being questioned, and they didn't like it. They gestured broadly, their voice rising slightly. "You've been making our staff uncomfortable," they said. "Your tone, your attitude, it's not appropriate for this environment." Uncomfortable. The protagonist nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. They had been polite and professional at every turn, even in the face of blatant disrespect. And yet, here they were, being painted as the villain in a story where they had done nothing wrong. It was an all too familiar narrative, one that relied on stereotypes and assumptions rather than facts. Meanwhile, the bystanders began to murmur. A young couple standing nearby exchanged whispered words, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and discomfort. One woman, clutching a designer handbag, leaned toward her friend and muttered, "That's just not right." Another man, standing near the door, glanced at the scene with a frown but said nothing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. And then, there were those who avoided looking altogether, their eyes fixed firmly on their phones or the racks of clothing, as though hoping the moment would pass without requiring their involvement. But not everyone stayed silent. A middle-aged woman with a bold, no-nonsense demeanor stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes, and I haven't seen this person do anything disruptive. In fact, I think they've been treated unfairly." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline in the growing sea of injustice. The protagonist turned to her, gratitude flickering across their face. But before they could respond, the manager waved her off dismissively. "Mom, this is a private matter," they said, their tone sharp. "We're handling it." "It doesn't look like you're handling it very well," the woman shot back. "If you're going to accuse someone of something, you'd better have evidence." The manager's face darkened, their posture stiffening further. They turned back to the protagonist, their voice low but firm. "If you can't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to call security." It was a threat, plain and simple, designed to intimidate. But the protagonist didn't flinch. They stood their ground, their eyes locked on the manager's, their voice unwavering as they replied. "Go ahead," they said. "Call security. I have nothing to hide." Their calm defiance was a challenge, a statement that they wouldn't be bullied into submission. And in that moment, the balance of power began to shift. The room had become eerily still, save for the soft murmur of whispers and the faint rustle of movement as customers shuffled awkwardly. The air, thick with tension, felt almost suffocating. The manager's threat of calling security hung over the scene like a storm cloud, but it wasn't fear that filled the protagonist, it was a quiet, simmering resolve. As the seconds dragged on, one thing became clear: the protagonist was no longer just addressing the manager. The incident had drawn attention, and now all eyes were on them. The store, once a bustling hive of quiet activity, had transformed into a stage, and the protagonist, whether they wanted to be or not, was now its reluctant centerpiece. The first phones came out silently, their cameras trained on the scene. A young man in a hoodie stood near the shoe display, angling his phone just enough to capture everything while trying not to draw attention to himself. Across the room, an older woman openly filmed, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval as she whispered to the person next to her. These weren't just casual onlookers anymore, they were witnesses, their recordings a quiet statement that what was happening here mattered. Not everyone chose to stay. A few customers, uncomfortable with the confrontation, slipped quietly toward the exits. They didn't want to get involved, didn't want to be part of whatever this was. To them, it was easier to walk away, to let the moment pass as if it had never happened. But others lingered, their expressions a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and, for some, outrage. "This is ridiculous," a woman near the perfume counter muttered under her breath. She glanced at the manager with open disdain before turning to her friend. "They haven't done anything wrong. You can see that." Her friend nodded but didn't say a word, her eyes darting nervously between the protagonist and the manager. Meanwhile, a man in a tailored suit, clearly someone who wasn't used to staying quiet, stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "I've been watching this whole thing, and I have to say, this doesn't seem right. This person hasn't done anything to warrant this kind of treatment." The manager turned toward him, their face flushed with frustration. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter. Please allow us to handle it." Their voice wavered slightly, the growing attention clearly rattling them. The protagonist took a deep breath, steadying themselves. Despite their calm exterior, they could feel the storm of emotions building inside: hurt, anger, humiliation. But they refused to let those emotions define this moment. They wouldn't give the manager the satisfaction of seeing them break. Instead, they straightened their posture, their voice clear and steady as they spoke. "I think it's important that we handle this openly," the protagonist said, their gaze sweeping across the room. They weren't just speaking to the manager anymore. They were addressing everyone. "Because what's happening here isn't just about me. It's about how people are treated based on assumptions, stereotypes, and bias. And I know I'm not the only one who's experienced this." Their words hung in the air, resonating with an undeniable truth. The murmurs grew louder now, pockets of conversation breaking out across the store. The young man filming near the shoe display whispered to his friend, "They're right. You see this kind of stuff all the time, but nobody ever calls it out." The protagonist continued, their voice unwavering. "I walked into this store today just like anyone else, with the expectation that I would be treated fairly and with respect. But from the moment I got here, I've been ignored, dismissed, and now falsely accused. All because someone decided I didn't belong here." The crowd was fully engaged now. Even those who had initially tried to ignore the scene couldn't help but listen. Some nodded quietly, their faces reflecting a mix of agreement and discomfort. Others looked down, guilt flickering across their expressions, as if the protagonist's words had struck a nerve. "Let me ask you something," the protagonist said, addressing the room directly. "If it were someone else, someone who looked different from me standing here, would they be treated this way? Would they be accused without evidence, dismissed without a second thought?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, their arms crossing defensively. "This isn't about race," they said, their voice sharp. But the protest sounded hollow, the weight of the crowd's attention making their words ring false. The protagonist turned back to the manager, their voice calm but unyielding. "Then what is it about?" they asked. "Because nothing I've done here today has warranted this treatment. And I think we all know that." The room was silent now, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Even those who had been hesitant to take sides seemed to be leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. And as the protagonists stood there, their dignity intact, despite the injustice they'd faced, it became clear that this moment was about more than just them. It was about challenging the unspoken rules that had allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked for so long. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the protagonist said, their voice softer now but no less powerful. "I'm here to stand up for myself and for anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. And I won't let this moment pass without making that clear." The crowd's reaction was a mix of emotions. Some nodded, murmuring words of support. A few clapped softly, their quiet applause an act of solidarity. Others remained silent, their expressions unreadable but their attention unwavering. And in the center of it all, the manager stood frozen, their authority crumbling under the weight of the truth that had just been spoken. The atmosphere in the store had shifted. What started as an isolated confrontation was now an undeniable spectacle, with a crowd of witnesses who were no longer passive observers. The protagonists stood firm, their words still echoing in the air, but the real turning point was just moments away. From the back of the crowd, a voice rose, firm and steady. "Actually, I can clear this up." Heads turned as an employee, a young woman wearing the store's uniform, stepped forward. She looked nervous but determined, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she approached the group. The manager's face paled at the sight of her. "Jessica," they said sharply, their tone carrying a clear warning. But the employee didn't waver. Instead, she turned to the protagonist, her expression apologetic. "I've been working here for 2 years, Jessica began, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "and I've seen how people are treated. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." She paused, glancing briefly at the manager before continuing. "And today, I watched it happen again. You didn't do anything wrong." The crowd murmured in response, the weight of Jessica's words rippling through them like a wave. The protagonist met her eyes, a mix of gratitude and surprise crossing their face. Jessica wasn't just an employee, she was a witness from within, someone whose voice carried undeniable credibility in this moment. "That's enough, Jessica," the manager snapped, their face flushed with anger. "You're out of line." But the words lacked conviction, their usual authority slipping away under the scrutiny of the crowd. Jessica took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "No, what's out of line is how you've treated this customer. I saw the whole thing. They asked for help politely, and you ignored them. When they insisted, you accused them without any proof." She gestured toward the protagonist, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't about policy. This is about you singling them out because of your own bias." The tension broke as others began to chime in. A man holding a shopping bag stepped forward. "She's right," he said, his voice firm. "I've been standing here watching, and this has been wrong from the start." Another customer, the middle-aged woman who had earlier defended the protagonist, added, "It's disgusting, honestly. You're treating someone like this for no reason other than your own prejudice. We can all see it." Her voice carried the sharp edge of indignation, her words echoing what many others in the room were thinking but hadn't yet said. Even those who had remained silent up to this point began to murmur their agreement. The crowd, once hesitant and fragmented, was now a unified force. And as the voices grew louder, the manager's defenses began to crumble. But instead of apologizing, the manager's posture grew more rigid. They glared at Jessica, then at the crowd, their voice rising in desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about," they snapped. "This is a private matter, and I was just following procedure." They gestured toward the protagonist, their hands shaking slightly. If they had cooperated from the start, this wouldn't have escalated. The words fell flat. The crowd's disapproval was palpable, their faces a mixture of disbelief and outrage. A woman in the back called out. "Cooperated with what? Being humiliated?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the manager's weak justification like a knife. The manager's agitation was clear now. Their words stumbled over each other, their usually confident demeanor unraveling under the growing scrutiny. They tried to regain control, pointing fingers and making excuses, but the more they spoke, the worse it became. "This has nothing to do with bias," they insisted, their voice almost pleading now. "I was just doing my job." But even they seemed to realize how hollow the excuse sounded. The protagonist, who had remained silent through the latest exchanges, took a step forward. Their voice was calm, measured, but filled with authority. "Doing your job doesn't include humiliating people based on assumptions," they said, their gaze locked on the manager. "And when you're called out for it, you double down instead of taking responsibility. That's not leadership, it's cowardice." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, a few even clapping softly. The manager's face flushed deeper, their mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and it was clear that the manager no longer held control of the situation. As the protagonist continued, their voice grew stronger. "I didn't come here today to make a scene. I didn't want this attention. But if standing up for myself means exposing this kind of behavior, then so be it." They looked out at the crowd now, their words meant for everyone. "Because this doesn't just affect me. It affects anyone who's ever been judged, dismissed, or mistreated for reasons that have nothing to do with their actions." The room was silent, except for the faint sound of someone recording on their phone. And then, one by one, people began to applaud. It started with Jessica, then the middle-aged woman, and soon the entire room joined in, their clapping a powerful statement of solidarity. The manager looked around, their confidence shattered. They tried to speak again, but the words were drowned out by the applause. Finally, they turned to the protagonist, their voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's best if you leave now," they said, their tone lacking the authority it once carried. But the protagonist didn't budge. Instead, they stood tall, their voice unwavering as they replied, "I'm not leaving. Not until you acknowledge what you've done here today." The manager hesitated, their gaze darting around the room. They looked at Jessica, who stood firm, at the crowd, whose faces reflected a mix of expectation and judgment, and finally at the protagonist. And in that moment, the weight of their actions became undeniable. For the first time, they were forced to confront the truth of what they'd done, and the realization left them visibly shaken. Just when it seemed like the tension had reached its peak, the faint sound of a ringtone cut through the murmurs of the crowd. A woman in a sharp blazer, who had been quietly observing near the entrance, raised her phone to her ear. Her expression shifted as she listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Without a word, she strode forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice firm and authoritative. "I'm Diane Fletcher, the regional manager. Can someone explain to me what's going on here?" Her question hung in the air as the crowd parted slightly to let her through. The store manager froze, their face going pale at the sight of their superior. "Miss Fletcher," they stammered, their tone suddenly deferential. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Diane replied, her gaze sweeping the scene. She took in the protagonist's calm but firm posture, the supportive murmurs of the crowd, and the phones still recording from various angles. "And yet here I am. Now why don't you start by explaining why half the store is filming you?" The manager stumbled over their words, offering a muddled explanation that painted them as the victim of an uncooperative customer. But before they could finish, Jessica stepped forward again, her voice steady and resolute. "Miss Fletcher," she began, "if I may, I've been here the whole time. And with all due respect, the manager's version of events isn't accurate." Jessica recounted the incident in detail, her words clear and unflinching. She described the protagonist's polite demeanor, the manager's escalating hostility, and the baseless accusations. Other customers chimed in, adding their observations and support for Jessica's account. A young man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I recorded the whole thing," he said, playing back a clip that clearly showed the manager's condescending tone and unfair accusations. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the video played, the evidence undeniable. Diane's face grew darker with every passing second. She turned to the manager, her voice cold. "Is this how you represent our company? By alienating and mistreating customers? By embarrassing this establishment in front of a crowd of witnesses?" The manager's defenses crumbled under the weight of the evidence. They opened their mouth to respond but quickly realized there was nothing they could say to justify their actions. The crowd's silent judgment bore down on them like a tidal wave. Diane took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "I'll deal with you shortly," she said to the manager, her tone leaving no room for argument. Then she turned to the protagonist, her demeanor shifting to one of contrition. "On behalf of the company, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what you've been subjected to today," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "This behavior is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of this organization." She paused, glancing back at the manager. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. Leave the premises." The crowd let out a collective gasp as the manager's face turned ashen. They tried to protest, but Diane cut them off. "I said leave," she repeated, her voice unyielding. Security personnel, alerted by the escalating situation, stepped forward to escort the manager out. The crowd parted again, watching silently as the disgraced manager was led away. With the manager gone, Diane turned back to the protagonist. "I can't undo what you've experienced here today," she said sincerely, "but I'd like to make it right in any way I can." She offered them a gift card, free services, or any form of restitution the protagonist found appropriate. But the protagonist, their composure still intact, shook their head. "What I want isn't a gift card or compensation," they said. "What I want is for this to be a lesson for this kind of behavior to end, not just here but everywhere." Their voice was calm but firm, their words carrying the weight of every injustice they'd ever faced. Diane nodded, visibly moved. "You're absolutely right," she said. "And I promise you, changes will be made." She gestured toward Jessica. "And to you, thank you for your courage in stepping forward. It's people like you who make real change possible." The crowd, silent till now, erupted into applause. It started with Jessica, then spread to the young man with the phone, the middle-aged woman, and finally the entire room. Their clapping was more than just a show of support. It was a rejection of the prejudice and injustice they had just witnessed. One customer called out, "Thank you for standing up for what's right." Another added, "We need more people like you in the world." The protagonist, usually reserved, couldn't help but smile at the overwhelming show of solidarity. For the first time since the ordeal began, they felt the weight of the moment begin to lift. As the crowd began to disperse, Diane turned to the protagonist one last time. "If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to follow up with you personally to ensure that real action is taken." The protagonist nodded, recognizing the sincerity in her offer. As they left the store, they were stopped by a few customers who offered words of encouragement and thanks. "What you did today mattered," one woman said, her voice filled with emotion. Not just for you, but for all of us. The protagonist walked away, their head held high. They had come in as just another customer, but left as a symbol of strength and dignity in the face of adversity. And as the store faded behind them, one thing was clear: this moment would not be forgotten. The protagonist walked out of the store, their stride steady, but their minds swirling with the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. The confrontation had been intense, but now there was a lingering silence, a moment of reflection that seemed to fill the space between the chaos and the resolution. They had stood up, faced down the injustice, and in doing so, had sparked something greater than a mere confrontation, something that had resonated deeply with everyone who had witnessed it. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the protagonist paused outside the store, the warm afternoon sun casting a golden glow across the pavement. They took a deep breath, looking around at the familiar faces still present. A few people had stopped to offer words of encouragement, but there was still a palpable weight in the air, an unspoken connection that bound everyone together in that shared moment of truth. The protagonist turned to face the crowd once more, their voice carrying the quiet strength that had defined them throughout the ordeal. "Thank you all for standing with me today," they began, their words calm but heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about one person being treated unfairly. This was about all of us, everyone who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel small simply because of the color of their skin. They paused for a moment, looking out over the crowd, their gaze sweeping across the faces of those who had stood by them. Racism doesn't just happen in the obvious moments we read about or hear on the news. It happens in the quiet, everyday actions, the small slights, the dismissals, the assumptions made about someone before they even open their mouth. It happens when we allow ourselves to forget the basic truth that we are all human, deserving of respect. A slight breeze ruffled the protagonist's hair, and they closed their eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering strength from the very air around them. It's easy to ignore these things, to turn away or pretend they don't exist. But if we don't speak out, if we don't stand up for each other, who will? This wasn't about me. This was about all of us finding the courage to do what's right, to hold ourselves accountable, and to say, enough is enough. The protagonist's words hung in the air like a quiet challenge. And then, one by one, members of the crowd stepped forward. First, it was the young woman who had stood beside them. "Jessica, you're right," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "We can't let these things slide anymore. We need to stand up not just for ourselves, but for the people around us, for everyone who feels they don't have a voice." The man who had filmed the entire incident nodded in agreement. "It's not enough to just watch. I've seen things like this before, but today, I realized I can do more than just stay quiet. I can make sure the right things are said and the right things are done." His words were simple, but they carried weight, resonating deeply with the others. As more people gathered, sharing stories and support, the protagonist's heart swelled with a quiet gratitude. A woman from the back of the crowd, her eyes shining with emotion, spoke up. "I've had my own experiences with discrimination, small things, big things, and I've always stayed quiet, thinking it wasn't my place to speak out. But today I realize how much power there is in standing together. You've given me the courage to speak up too." One by one, more individuals shared their stories. Some had been the targets of overt racism, while others had faced the more subtle forms of prejudice. A middle-aged man with graying hair spoke about an incident at his workplace where his abilities were questioned because of his race, even though he had years of experience. "You just learn to smile and walk away," he said with a bitter laugh, "because you don't want to rock the boat. But after today, I'm not so sure I can stay silent anymore." The woman who had earlier called out the manager's actions raised her voice, adding her own experience. "I've been in stores, at restaurants, even at family gatherings, where I was treated like I didn't belong. People assumed things about me, looked down on me, or worse, completely ignored me. But we can't just accept that. Not anymore." There was a quiet but powerful shift in the crowd, a collective realization that they weren't alone in their experiences, that their stories, though painful, were shared by others who had faced similar struggles. For many, this was the first time they had ever spoken about these injustices, and in that moment, it was as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The protagonist listened intently, nodding along with each story shared. There was a sense of unity in the air, a quiet strength that seemed to bind them all together. "This is what change looks like," they said softly. "When we stand together, when we speak up, we make it harder for injustice to thrive. We make it harder for people to get away with mistreating others without consequences." The crowd fell into a moment of reflective silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, considering the impact of the events that had transpired. And then, as if in a silent agreement, people began to share contact information, make plans to meet, and offer support to one another. "We're not just standing here because of what happened today," the protagonist continued. "We're standing here because we know that when we stand together, we can make real change happen. And we won't stop. Not until it's normal for people to be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, no matter who they are, where they come from, or the color of their skin." As the last of the crowd filtered away, the protagonist stood for a moment longer, watching as those who had gathered went their separate ways. The store had returned to its normal rhythm, but something was different now. A sense of resolve lingered in the air. People had found their voice. They had found strength in numbers. And as they walked away from the scene, they knew that what had just happened wasn't just a one-off event. It was the beginning of something far greater. For the protagonist, the journey was far from over. But in that moment, they felt the weight of the fight lift just a little. The battle for justice was long, but today they had made a difference. Today they had made sure that racism had been confronted, exposed, and condemned in front of a crowd that refused to stay silent. And with that, they walked away stronger, more resolute, and hopeful that this small victory could spark something bigger, something lasting. The dust had settled, but the ripple effects of the events at the store were far from over. The story of the confrontation, the manager's disgrace, and the protagonist's bravery made headlines across local news outlets the next day. News stations, social media platforms, and even blogs picked up the story, broadcasting it as an example of how ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, can stand up and challenge injustice in real time. As for the manager, the consequences were swift and clear. After an internal investigation, they were permanently fired from their position. The company, embarrassed by the incident, issued a public statement apologizing for their employees' actions and reaffirmed their commitment to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. However, many in the community felt that this was just the beginning. The firing of one individual, while necessary, wasn't enough to address the broader systemic issues that had been exposed that day. People were talking about the problem in a way they hadn't before, about how subtle prejudices can build into overt racism, and how standing up in those moments can make a real difference. But while the actions taken in the store that day had made an impact, the real question remained. What happens next? The protagonist's fight, while a victory, was just one chapter in a much larger story. And now, that story was in the hands of everyone who had witnessed it. The truth is, the protagonist's voice echoed through the narrator's reflection. We are all responsible. It's easy to assume someone else will step in, that someone else will speak up. But the truth is, silence only helps perpetuate the problem. We all have a role to play in changing how people of color are treated, not just in the big moments, but in the everyday moments when prejudice rears its ugly head. So, as you watch this video today, I ask you, what will you do? Have you ever witnessed a situation like this? Maybe you've seen someone being dismissed or belittled. Maybe you've heard a harmful comment in passing. How did you respond? Did you speak up? Did you stand by and let it go unnoticed? Or did you decide that in that moment you had the power to make a difference? Think about it. Reflect on your own experiences. Racism isn't a battle that can be won with a single act, a single moment. It's an ongoing struggle, a fight that requires each of us to challenge our own biases, to hold others accountable, and to demand better for everyone. We can't afford to wait for the next big headline or viral moment to decide we're going to take action. Every day is an opportunity to stand up against injustice, to lift up those who are oppressed, and to make the world a fairer place for all. If you believe in this cause, if you stand with the protagonist today, share this video. Let the message be heard far and wide. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's create a community where we can challenge each other, learn from one another, and fight together for a world where no one ever has to face the kind of injustice witnessed here. We've all been given the chance to make a difference. It's time to take it. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant, stay brave, and always stand up against injustice. Share, comment, and subscribe. If you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button, share this video, and comment your thoughts below. Let's keep the conversation going and make our voices heard. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that challenges the status quo. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching.